dating life of anthropologists, which it's not quite as exciting as No One's Place. No one slaps anyone, no one pushes anyone in the pool. But I do include some lies, some deceit, and some intrigue in the talk tonight. And I admit from the outset that I have a very minimal understanding of basic chemistry. So permit me to assume that some of you also have a minimal understanding of anthropology. And with that, before I actually begin my talk, I wanted to start off making sure we're all on the same page before I start talking about fossils by giving you a very quick background of what anthropology is and what we do. Normally, when I tell people I'm an anthropologist, it comes in images of this. And the biggest disappointment, I have to say, is not that we don't need lives, Avenger says as Indiana Jones, because some of us do. The big disappointment is that most anthropologists don't look like Harrison Ford. It's sad but true. I'm still coming to terms with it. Most look like this. Like I should have read a baby tackle shop in the Pacific Northwest. And I think if more anthropologists did look like Harrison Ford, there'd be a lot more people studying. Usually, when people find out that I'm an anthropologist, they ask me if I study other cultures, they ask me if I dig up bones. And the answer is anthropologists do all of those things. Anthropology is the study of humankind, past and present. So we study the behavior and culture of living people, we study their languages, and we study their biological makeup. And we also study our past. We look at changes over time in the behavior and biology of humans and our ancestors. So but not all of us do all of those things. So these are the four fields of anthropology. And my specialty is the last one, biological anthropology. And within that, I have a subspecialty in paleoanthropology, which is human evolution. So I look at sites that contain fossil skeletons and analyze those skeletons to reconstruct our deep past and our evolutionary history. And the goal is to ultimately identify what our place in nature is. So tonight, the talk is going to be mostly about fossils. And in particular, I'm going to talk about the story of two fossil finds. And you'll hear the story of how they were found and how we went about understanding where they fit on our family tree. But I actually have a couple of broader goals in talking about these two fossils. And that is, what they are, to answer two questions, or to address two questions, because I'm not sure I have the answers. The first is to share with you how the science of anthropology is conducted, to explain how we go about collecting our data, interpreting it, and drawing conclusions. Drawing the picture of our evolutionary history and understanding our place in nature. And actually through this is where I'm going to fit in a couple of bits of chemistry for you. And you'll see how in a social science that you would expect like anthropology, and understanding of basic chemistry really makes all the difference in how we know what we know. And then my second point is to explore with you the question that anthropologists ask themselves every day. And that's the question of what makes us human. What distinguishes us as a species? What defines us within the animal kingdom? What defines our lineage? So those are going to be the two themes that are woven throughout my talk. And since tonight's talk contains a lot of pictures of fossils and bones, and since this is part of the first year chemistry program, I thought it might help if I began with a quick explanation of what a fossil actually is, what I mean when I'm talking about a fossil and how it's formed. Usually before I became an anthropologist, whenever someone said fossil, I thought immediately of an impression of the leaves in a rock. That's all I thought of. Or a bug. It could have been a bug, but it was always an impression in a rock. And since then, dinosaurs have become a lot bigger for kids growing up. So you probably know that bones fossilize as well. Knowing the condition in which bones fossilize is important for us because it tells us how the organism, the individual that we're studying, lived, and also how it died. And in our field, context, those clues of the environment in which an organism lived and died are the key. And in order to really appreciate those, we also have to know how the biology of bone interacts with that environmental context. So this is one of two sides of chemistry. Bone is composed of organic and inorganic molecules. And after an organism dies, usually everything disintegrates. But if something is going to be left, it's going to be the inorganic part, because it's harder, it takes longer to disintegrate. And it makes up the hard structure of bone. Before it disintegrates, it can actually be infused with minerals from the surrounding soil in which it's buried. And if that happens, then it basically turns it into a rock. And it could be a bone-shaped rock, shaped like a skull, but it's essentially a rock. And that is important because it keeps it from being destroyed. It keeps it in the fossil record for us to find. That occurrence is really rare. Fossilization is really rare. Typically what happens is an organism dies, and immediately it becomes a meal for a bunch of scavengers. Nothing remains for preservation usually. But in certain cases, the individual can be buried by natural forces before it can be scavenged. And for example, you may have heard of the Leakey family working in East Africa, or you may have heard of Don Johanson working in Ethiopia, which is also East Africa. And much of their research is done in what looks like a desert today, but in the time period that they're studying, is actually an ancient lake bed. And individuals would die along this lake bed, and they would be buried fairly rapidly by sinking into the lake bed. And that protected their bodies and allowed the bones to remain, to fossilize. And then, over the course of millions of years, the lake bed dried up, the fossil was buried in soil, the soil eroded, and the fossil came to the surface to be discovered by anthropologists millions of years later. So that's one way in which fossilization can occur. Another way in which we can find fossils is because, conveniently enough, they started to be buried about 60,000 years ago. So starting with Neanderthals, humans began burying their dead, which is mighty convenient for us. So these fossilized skeletons make up the body of research that anthropologists study. The main body, not the only body of research. So hopefully now you have a better understanding of what a fossil is. And I want to begin now telling you my tale of two fossils. And just a little aside here. The reason that I chose to talk about these two fossils today is because, and one thing that I want you to think about in the course of my talk, is I'm fascinated by the social and political context in which science occurs. You'd think that what we're conducting is a more or less objective process. We try our best to be objective. We try our best to interpret our finds and analyze our data and come to conclusions as objectively as possible. But the truth is that you can never be completely objective. The social context in which we're working always influences how easy it is for us to accept something as fact. And it also influences how willing the public is to accept something as fact. And sometimes they can reject something based not at all on the data, but simply on what society is prepared to believe is true. So with that in mind, if we go back 200 years to the early 1800s, we're at a time before Darwin had written On the Origin of Species. So that came out in 1859. And in the first half of the 1800s, a few fossil skulls had been documented in Europe. They had been found before he published his famous book. And one of them actually was found in the Neander Valley, the Neanderthal, which is Neander Valley. And he knew about this Neanderthal specimen when he was writing The Origin of Species. But there were just a few. So he published his book, and he really didn't want to address the issue of human evolution. For him, the issue was evolution of any species. It was the principle of evolutionary change in the natural world. However, his book did cause a major shift in how naturalists understood the world around them. And what it did was it allowed for the possibility that these odd-looking skulls weren't just pathological. They weren't just these sick individuals from recent times that should be discarded. Darwin had opened up the possibility that the human form wasn't fixed and unchanging, that it did change over time, and that these fossils may have represented the past form of humans. And keep in mind that this was also at the height of colonialism. So as this avenue of inquiry opened up, European naturalists began traveling to colonial regions in Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. And they began turning up enough specimens to really merit a proper systematic study as to how old they were and to what they meant, what their significance was. And so by the turn of the last century, we began getting publications on these fossils, proper scientific inquiries into what these fossils meant, into the fossil evidence of human evolution. And one of these scientists, enter the first character in our story, was a young Australian who was working in South Africa, who had been trained in England, by the name of Raymond Dart. He was a professor of anatomy, and at the newly developed University of Witwatersrand, in what was then a backwater gold mining town known as Johannesburg. And he was really bored at having been at having been appointed at this little backwater town. He didn't want to take this post. He dragged his wife to South Africa from England. And to keep himself occupied, he began a contest with his students. Whoever could bring him the most unusual fossil would win a reward. The reward was £5, I should say, but at the time I think that was probably more than spending money. Now, this wasn't actually a crazy contest, because South Africa, among its many geological treasures of diamonds and gold, also has a series of underground caverns that are preserved for thousands of years, and for millions of years, and they preserve thousands of fossils. And that's because South Africa sits on a huge bedrock of limestone and dolomite, and the groundwater is acidic. So it eats away at the rock, and it creates these enormous underground caverns. And in the past, we're talking millions of years ago now, occasionally a shaft would open up to the surface, and animals walking over these holes wouldn't see them, and they would fall in. And these underground caves basically kind of served as this collection bin for the animals living millions of years ago. Then, over the course of 2 to 3 million years, the ground surface eroded, and the top of the caverns were revealed, and the fossils inside were revealed, sometimes. But also, South Africa and their huge limestone resources became a major place for quarrying limestone as a raw material. And so, in fact, there were lots of quarries, limestone quarries around South Africa. There still are. So Dart knew all this. So it wasn't a crazy contest. He knew all this, and he knew that quarry workers were likely to find fossils. And if he could get his anatomy students to bring them to him, he would be able to keep himself occupied. And sure enough, one day in 1924, Dart was actually getting ready to be the best man at his best friend's wedding, which I think was being held at his house. And two crates of fossils arrived from these workmen. They actually, a workman who was working at a quarry named Taung actually, heard about Dart's interest in fossils. And so he sent Dart 2 crates of fossils that he had collected while he had worked as a quarryman at Taung and a couple of other sites. And so Dart's wife threatened his life if he took off his tie and opened the crates. And so Dart waited for his wife to leave, and then he took off his tie and he opened the crates. And the first thing he found in the first crate, the very first thing sitting at the top, was a big brown blob. No, it was an endocast of a human brain. Not a human brain, but the endocast of a brain. And the reason that we know that this is the endocast of a brain is because, just so you know, your brain sits really tightly inside your skull, which is good, because then otherwise it would really be sloshing around in there. So it's got a really glove-like fit inside your skull. So much so that it has left the impression of the outer surface of the brain on the inside of the skull. So if I were to cast the inside of a skull, I would actually have a cast of the outer surface of the brain. And that actually happened naturally. And Dart recognized this immediately as the endocast of a natural endocast of a brain. So he started rooting around inside to see if it fit a face anywhere. And then as he writes it, he says that, "My wife tells me she came twice to tell me to get ready for the wedding, but I don't remember hearing her." But then his best friend arrived and said, "Dude, you're my best man, we need to go." So he went, and he says that he thought about this endocast the whole time he was serving as his best friend's best man. And as soon as the ceremony was over, he went back to the crates and he rifled through them. And sure enough, he found a face that had fit inside perfectly. So he knew they went together. Now, from the moment that Dart saw this, he knew that it was not just a fossil baboon or a fossil chimpanzee or anything like that. First of all, he saw the size. He knew that it was much larger than either one of those would be for its age. And the reason that we know its age is because this little guy has his first, or her first, molar erupted, which happens in humans at 6. Your first permanent tooth comes in at around the age of 6. In chimpanzees, it comes in at around the age of 3.5. So this little guy was between the ages of 4 and 6. And for that age, his brain was much bigger than an ape's would be. But it was not as big as a human's would be. It was somewhere in the middle. So that was one thing that tipped Dart off immediately, that he had something unusual. But the other thing was not just the size of the brain relative to the teeth. It was also the actual architecture of the brain, the way it was shaped, and most importantly, importantly, he could tell from the shape of the brain that the spinal cord exited down from the bottom of the brain and not from the back. And that is a crucial feature of animals that walk on 2 feet, because we, as bipeds, have everything balanced perfectly atop a vertical vertebral column, a vertical backbone. Apes don't have that because they do not walk upright. They walk on all fours. So they have their spinal cord exiting at an angle from the back. Dart saw that this individual actually had his spinal cord exiting from the bottom of the brain, meaning that he had to have been an upright walker. He had to have been a biped. And based on the fossil remains associated with it, Dart estimated that this little guy or girl was probably around 1 million years old. Now we know that he's probably closer to 2.25 million years. One of the things that I love the most about this story is that Dart is one of the few human beings in the world at that time who could have recognized the significance of what he had as soon as he saw it, because he had done his PhD in primate neuroanatomy. His specialty was the shape and size of the brains of primates, of baboons and chimpanzees and all of our other living relatives and humans. So he is one of the people who could have known from the outset what he had and what its significance was. So he named his fossil Australopithecus africanus, the southern ape of Africa. And the world paid attention to this discovery because at the time it was believed that Asia was going to be the locality of our earliest ancestors, that was going to be the site of human origins. And with this discovery, Dart was saying a couple of revolutionary things. First, he was saying that humankind really emerged in Africa. But he was also saying something else that really kind of got people. He was saying that the earliest humans were not ape-like humans. The earliest humans were something much less interesting. They were human-like apes, which was a significant difference. And he had a hard time selling his case. For one thing, he had given it a mix of Greek and Latin names, which apparently is just tacky in science. But really the big problem was that it was pretty standard to think that what defined us was our big brains. And logically then, to be a human ancestor, you had to have a big brain first. You could have big teeth, big jaws, it didn't really matter. But you really couldn't have a small brain and a human-like face. That wasn't really sitting with people. Now, that whole worldview was in place at the time, that whole model of thinking. It really affected the acceptance of Tong, and it really affected Dart's work. But it was in place because of a find that had been made in England 12 years earlier. And this fossil later became known as one of the greatest scientific hoaxes. It's called the best known hoax in anthropology, but to be fair, it's the only hoax in anthropology, and it's the Piltdown hoax. So, in order to really understand why it took decades for people to accept, for the scientific community to accept Dart's interpretations, it's important to set the stage for what was known in paleoanthropology at the time that it was discovered. So, I'm going to explain to you the story of Piltdown, which takes us back to 1912, so this is before Tong was found, obviously. And a find was made that made headlines around the world, or at least around Europe and the US. And it was made by a man named Charles Dawson. Dawson was an amateur archaeologist and geologist who says that he was following some workmen who were digging gravel paths near his place in Piltdown in Sussex, England. And as they were digging, Dawson claimed to find a number of fossils. And these included fragments of thick human skull bones, and a fragment of a jawbone, and some crude flint tools, and then some fossils of hippopotamus and elephant, extinct hippopotamus and elephant species. And the bones were this sort of chocolate-colored brown, and the hippopotamus bones were fossilized. And so all of this suggested that these were really old and that they were from the Ice Age. So he brought his finds to the Natural History Museum in London to a man who was the keeper of the geology collection, a man named Arthur Smith Woodward. And Woodward, who was a very prominent scientist, came to the conclusion that the cranial bones and the jaw bones both belonged to a single individual that was a strange mixture of human and ape. Unlike Tong, which had not been found yet, this fit the expectations of the human ancestor. It was an ape-like human, and it had a big brain and an ape-like face. So Woodward named it Anthropus dawsoni, the Dawn Man, and it was given its place on human evolutionary lineage. The story you hear is that everyone embraced this, But the truth is that never happens in anthropology. We never embrace anything. We love to debate, and we love to disagree, and we love to overanalyze things. So, because we don't have a huge fossil record, so we obsessively focus on the minutiae of each fossil that we do find, and it keeps us busy. So they did that with this. From the beginning, I should say, a few prominent anthropologists did question it, but nobody questioned its authenticity because there was no reason to. We don't go around assuming that people have falsified their data. It wouldn't be much of a society if we did that. However, people did know that it was anomalous. One prominent anthropologist, for example, immediately, his first publication was to note how similar the Piltdown jaw was to that of an orangutan, an Asian ape. Others noted how similar the skull bones were to that of a sick modern human, a modern human with a certain pathology that thickens the skull bone. But it wasn't rejected from the outset, partly because there was no evidence to contradict it, and also because, as I said, the social and the political climate in which science is conducted plays a role in what we're inclined to accept more easily. And in this case, the find was consistent with what people wanted to believe. Hominids had been found in China, they'd been found in Indonesia, they'd been found all over Europe, mainland Europe. They'd been found in Germany and in Belgium, and the French had one, and England wanted one. England wanted a fossil. This was at a time when the sun was never setting on the British Empire. So how could England not play a role in the march towards humanity? How could England not play a role in the development of humanness? So Piltdown took its place on our evolutionary tree. But over the course of the next 2 decades, more and more finds were made, and it became obvious that this couldn't fit in. And as more publications were made and models were drawn, sometimes Piltdown would just sort of have its own question mark branch, and some anthropologists just started leaving it off of their models altogether. But no one publicly questioned the authenticity of it, because, like I said, that's not something you do. Partly because you're dealing with real people, and you'd be offending prominent scientists if you were to say that they lied and falsified their data. That's okay, though, because all the personalities and socio-political climate can't really stop what I call the test drive of the self-correcting nature of science that anthropologists like to constantly take it out for. Science is founded, among other principles, on the concept of repeatability. So I come up with a hypothesis, I fail to falsify it, I continually fail to falsify it, but then I make sure that my hypothesis gets out there so that other scientists can test it and can test drive it, can make sure that it holds up or can fail to hold it up. That's how we settle upon something as a scientific fact. And if something is not repeatable, it does get thrown out. In this case, as more and more finds were unearthed in the 20s and in the 30s and the 40s, Piltdown became much more of an anomaly. More of the finds were really confirming what Dart had said about human evolution, that brains did not really get big, did not get human-like first. Really, that we were small-faced bipedal apes for a very long time. I also said that that you don't question top scientists, you don't question their the truthfulness of what they're saying. But over the course of the next 2 or 3 decades, the main players in Piltdown, Dawson died actually in 1916, Woodward retired, and as these people sort of stepped aside, that opened the door for a new generation of scientists with new methods to come in and really rigorously question this evidence. And ultimately, it was chemists who unearthed, who resolved the issue and also unearthed it as a hoax. No one was setting out to do this, but that's what they ended up doing. Initially, the goal was just to date the remains and see if the skull and the jawbones went together at the same time period, to see if they were both recent, if they were from the same time period as these extinct fossil mammals, and also to see if what they could find out about the stone tools. And it was the whole dating thing that that revealed the hoax. The method of dating that was applied was a method known as fluorine analysis. Several decades earlier, a Frenchman had analyzed a large number of bones from different geological horizons at one site. And he showed that the average fluorine content of bones that are in the same site at different horizons changes with age. There are small traces of fluorine in the groundwater. And it's known now that fluorine gets trapped in the inorganic matrix of bone. It serves as a trap for wandering fluorine ions, and it doesn't release them. So they accumulate fluorine in their content over the course of time. And if a bone is lying in a sandy or gravelly matrix for thousands of years, it gradually absorbs this fluorine. And this provides a convenient way for dating the age of 2 or 3 specimens at a given site relative to each other. If they don't have the same amount of fluorine, they're not the same age. I should just say that you can't really do this comparing one site to another, because the amount of fluorine present in groundwater is different from site to site. So really this only works if you're focusing on one site. And sure enough, fluorine analyses of the bones revealed that they were not old. That the skull and the jawbone were recent, they were not of the Ice Age, that they were not nearly the same time period as the fossil mammal bones that had been found, and they weren't even the same age as each other. Chemical analyses of the stone tools, it's just embarrassing, because what happened was the stone tools had been artificially stained on the outside. They basically were these chalk flints that are found in southern England, and they had been stained on the outside with the chemical analysis revealed that it was chromium and iron. When the scientists chipped the stone to get a sample for dating, they noticed that the outside was brown and the inside was white, which does not happen in nature. Flint is brown all the way through if it's really flint. So I don't even think that they bothered really testing its age. And you really can't, but they don't really think they needed to, because it was obvious that this was a stained piece of recent rock. So ultimately, Piltdown was revealed as a hoax, and the skull, as it turns out, was probably taken from a Roman cemetery nearby, and was an individual who died of a disease that thickened its skull bones. The mandible, the lower jaw, was that of an orangutan, and in order to make sure that the jaw fit the skull, whoever had done this broke off what we call the condyles, the area of the bone that articulates with the skull, and had sawed the teeth down so the whole thing would fit better. So this was actually a fairly educated hoax. Whoever was carrying this out kind of knew what they were doing. For several decades, no one knew who'd done it, and every single person who had ever uttered the word pill carrying out this hoax. Dawson was, and I love this picture, by the way. My favorite thing about this picture, Darwin, right there, looking at all of them going, "You're a bunch of liars." So Dawson was considered the biggest culprit. And he probably did do it. And he had to have had help, because he didn't have access to the materials, he didn't have access to the bones, and he didn't have that level of detailed anatomical understanding. The other part of this story that I wasn't going to tell you, but you really should know, is that one of the reasons why Dawson is a serious suspect is because he had befriended a local chemistry teacher and asked him what chemicals he should use if he wanted to make bone look really old. So just, if any of you become chemistry teachers and someone comes to you asking you that question, and then like 2 years later they discover bones, you should alert the authorities, because they probably lied. So he probably did carry this out, and he probably had help. No one knew who that help was. I doubt it was any of the anthropologists, because no one would risk their career. I mean, if you really love what you do, you don't need to make up your data, and you don't need to find a famous fossil in order to continue loving what you do and having faith in it. So I doubt it was any of them. They would never risk their career for that. But in 1996, the Natural History Museum in London announced that they had found a trunk in their attic with more stained bones in them, and some of them, I'm not making this up because I couldn't make this up, were painted brown with some paint that had been purchased from a local art store and scraped off. So whoever did this either thought everyone was really stupid or just thought it was funny. And the fact that these stained bones were found in a trunk in the Natural History Museum meant that it was someone other than Dawson. I mean, Dawson had to have an accomplice to carry all this out. The person who's ultimately emerged as probably the biggest culprit is a guy named Martin Hinton. He was the keeper of the zoology collections at the museum at the time. Whether he was doing this as a big practical joke that got carried away, whether he wanted to make fools of people, or some people think that Dawson initially started this hoax and Hinton wanted to expose him by planting what were clearly ludicrous painted teeth in the same beds in order to make Dawson look bad. No one really knows. But ultimately, like I said, it was revealed as a hoax. And by 1954, with the help of chemists, Piltdown was taken off of our lineage unequivocally, and 30 years after its discovery, Tong took its rightful place as the earliest, at the time, earliest known hominid. And by that time, a number of other sites had been found. This is Tong compared to Piltdown. By that time, a number of other sites had been found in South Africa, confirming, including adult specimens, confirming what Dart had said all along and what he had predicted. Now, one reason why I thought it would be fun to tell this story is because it's interesting, and I think the characters are very interesting. I think they're fascinating, actually. But also, like I said, I wanted to reveal something about the scientific process. And anthropologists, even though we aren't always objective, and certainly we aren't always right. One of my professors, when I was a grad student, said with great pride that anthropologists are the only people who could make their career on being totally wrong most of the time. And we can, because the science of anthropology is always self-correcting. The scientific principle of repeatability is alive and well in our discipline. And it's not bad that we're wrong, because we want to find out when we're wrong. We want to refine our hypotheses and refine our understanding of the data that we're collecting. And it adds to our understanding of human evolution. So for me, all the missteps in this story, they don't disillusion me at all. Quite the opposite. They give me a lot of faith in my field and in what I do. So now at this point, we're left with Dart and the elimination of Piltdown. And the question that paleoanthropology started to turn to was, if we aren't defined by our big brains, then what does distinguish us? What is the defining trait of our lineage? What should we look for in the fossil record to determine who goes on our direct ancestry? Today we know that chimps are our closest living relatives, but when the split occurred, there had to have been, we and chimps probably looked a lot like what our common ancestor looked like, but we had to have looked somewhat different. What was the trait that distinguished us? What set us apart biologically or behaviorally at the very beginning of our lineage that ultimately led to us? Well, Darwin thought it was tools. He thought that it was tool making and tool use, that walking upright really was in order to free our hands to use tools. And this theory was pursued, but the evidence over the last 30 years has been clear. First of all, tool making and tool use is not unique to humans. Chimpanzees do it. Families of chimpanzees use tools together as a pastime. But worse yet, we know now the earliest known stone tool is several million years older than the earliest known biped. No, several million years younger than the earliest known biped. So walking upright and using tools were not at all coincidental events. They weren't related at all. What about brain size? Well, we've already talked about brain size. We also know when brain size, when an enlarged brain occurred in our past, in our lineage. And we know that brain size stays within the range of apes for the first couple million years of human evolution. Some people have said that it's the fact that we ate meat and we hunted, which we thought other primates didn't do. And this sounds reasonable enough. It's the man-the-hunter model. And in fact, Dart believed this model very vigorously. And it did prevail for a while. It prevailed into the 70s and even into the 80s to some extent. It didn't sit too well with the feminists who resented the model because it implied that the men went out and did all the provisioning and the women stayed home and tended to the hearth. But it was in fact not the feminist movement that undid the man-the-hunter model. It was evidence from two other scientific fields. First, primatologists observed chimps hunting, and this, I'm sad to say, is two chimpanzees right after they have cooperatively hunted and killed and are now ripping to shreds a poor little red colobus monkey. So chimps hunt cooperatively, and they are not vegetarians. They will eat meat. We used to think all of the primates were vegetarians. But more importantly, and this is my last little bit of chemistry for you, chemical analyses helped us resolve the issue. As I said, with Piltdown, fluorine gets trapped in the inorganic matrix of bone when it's been laying in the ground for a while. Well, in fact, dentists became very interested in this phenomenon because if it's present in small amounts in drinking water, then it gets trapped in the enamel of growing teeth, of children whose teeth are growing, whose permanent teeth are coming in, and it can help prevent tooth decay. The reason is because teeth, unlike bone, are fixed and unchanging once they're formed. If you break a bone, your body remodels that bone. It heals the bone. If you chip a tooth, that's it. It's chipped. Your body doesn't remodel teeth. So what you got, your permanent teeth, once they come in, that's it. That's what you have. The convenient thing is that teeth then serve as a permanent record of what people ate during their childhood. Because if you eat certain types of food, they leave a chemical signature in your tooth, in the composition of your tooth. And in particular, scientists, like you are what you eat. So in particular, scientists like to study various isotopes, but in this case, in the study of Australopithecines, the study of two isotopes of carbon, carbon-13 and carbon-12. They show up in your teeth in different ratios depending on what your diet was. So if you eat grasses, you'll have more C13 relative to C12. And if you eat fruits, leaves, and nuts, then you'll have a lower ratio of C13 to C12. And studies of the isotope ratios of Australopithecus teeth have showed that they had a diet that suggests it was grassier. Well, that would be great, except any of you who know anything about cows know that any animal that eats grass has a very complex digestive system. More than one stomach, for example. And early humans, we know, didn't have that. They don't have the body size for that. So the assumption was that they were eating things, maybe they were eating things that ate grasses, so maybe they were a little higher up on the food chain, as it were. That's fine, doesn't refute the man-the-hunter model, but actually, the issue isn't that simple, and it's unresolved, because the truth is that there are other things that can cause the same ratio, so insects and roots and tubers. The point is that whatever these graphs are indicating, whatever these ratios are indicating, they're clearly not exclusive to meat eaters. More than that, we can just look at the shape of the teeth to know that a carnivore has very pointed teeth. Don't worry about this. This is just because dogs rely more on smell. So it's not the shape of the dental arcade, it's really just the shape of individual teeth. And carnivores, animals that rely primarily or predominantly on meat, have very sharp teeth. And as you can see, Australopithecines do not have the same shape of tooth. So, the net result is to just put the kibosh on the whole man-the-hunter model as a defining feature of humans and their ancestors, because it's not likely that that developed very early in our evolutionary history. So what's left? Well, Dart's tongue fossil can really only be said for certain to have had, oh, and sorry, before I even get to that, what was even worse with the whole man-the-hunter model was not only were we not the hunters, probably we were the hunted, which I have to say, you know, you guys correct me if I'm wrong, but when this was revealed, not only were we not the predators, we were probably the prey. This is a skull of an Australopithecus and a leopard, and the teeth marks fit perfectly in there. That doesn't mean that that leopard killed that Australopithecus, but that Australopithecus was probably killed by a leopard and dragged up into a tree and eaten. When this was revealed, I have to say, I think some people were really dismayed, like, oh, come on, okay, we didn't kill, but weren't we, you know, we weren't so stupid as to get picked off the landscape by other animals, were we? Well, sadly, we probably were. So it's all very unillustrious. And really what's left is that Dart's tongue fossil can only be said for certain to have, its only unique feature was its bipedal locomotion, walking upright on 2 feet. What this means, and what's accepted now, is that the initial defining trait of our lineage is the evolution of bipedality, the ability to walk on 2 feet. That is the main defining criteria now for becoming a member of our subfamily Homininae, which includes humans and our immediate ancestors. So basically, to answer the question of what defines us, we basically began as a bunch of semi-vegetarian bipedal apes. It wasn't with language, it wasn't with tool making, it wasn't with excellent hunting skills, it wasn't with a large brain. It was that we walked on 2 legs, which, like I said, does sound really kind of unillustrious and anticlimactic. But not really if you think about it, because over the course of a couple million years, that ended up being a mighty handy adaptation. We did, in fact, end up using our hands to make tools. And those tools enabled us to scavenge meat a little more successfully. And ultimately, to increase the protein in our diet, to increase the animal bone marrow and the meat in our diet. And eventually, the technology to hunt developed. And having this protein-rich diet of meat and bone marrow enabled us to support a metabolically expensive tissue, which we like to call the brain. And with this protein, calorie-rich diet, we could support an expanding brain. The expanding brain, very conveniently enough, enabled us to develop technologies like making fire. And with fire, we were able to occupy latitudes north of Africa that weren't tropical anymore, and inhabit regions that we normally wouldn't have been able to inhabit. It enabled us to develop the capacity for language, for symbolic expression, for art. We developed the ability for long-term planning, and ultimately, it enabled us not just to adapt to our environment, but to adapt our environment to ourselves. So bipedality ended up being a very useful thing indeed. Not a bad thing to define the beginning of our lineage. Now, no matter what, I don't want to send the message that the emergence of our own species, Homo sapiens, was the process of perfection. We are not the endpoint of some directed process of perfection. We're not at the pinnacle of anything. None of this was purposeful. If we've learned anything from the fossil record, it's that randomness is what defines our ancestry. For most of our evolutionary history, there were multiple bipedal apes wandering around the Earth, each of them with their own specialized adaptations. Some of them were very successful in their own way, surviving for over 1 million years. Our own genus, the genus Homo, emerged about 2 million years ago, and within that, people assigned fossils to a handful of species, and only a few had any lasting success. Our own species, Homo sapiens, only emerged fairly recently. The oldest specimen is only 180,000 years old, and the oldest known specimen from Europe is only 35 to 40,000 years old. So if longevity is any measure of success, then I would say we are by no means the most successful species, and I do think longevity is a measure of success. My own research is actually about this time period. It's about the transition from previous species to our own species, Homo sapiens. And I think this really heightens or shifts the question of what it means to be human. We've sort of resolved what defines the beginning of our lineage, and anthropologists now are focusing on our time period. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be Homo sapiens? So it's no longer a question of looking at what distinguishes us from our closest primate relatives. It's a question of who gets to say that they're us. What do we do with Neanderthals, for example, who look different, but for a long time they're behaviorally identical to us, and they probably interbred with us? How important is it to classify something that looks different as being actually biologically different? And how much diversity can we stand within our own species? For example, take this person, this guy, it's actually a female probably. It's a fossil from India. Has a brain size that falls within the range of modern Homo sapiens. Her cranial capacity is about 1,280 cubic centimeters. Modern humans' brain size ranges from about 1,100 to about 1,600. The average is about 1,350 to 1,450. So she falls within our range in certain key traits, like the size of her brain. But clearly, she doesn't look modern to us. I mean, she's got this sort of prominent brow ridge, and she doesn't have a nice vertical forehead. She's got this, sloping forehead. And certainly she's not modern. She's probably about 250,000 years old. And culturally, there's absolutely no evidence that her behavior was in any way as complex as ours. So this is the time period I work on. These are the fossils I work on. And I don't have an answer as to what makes us human. I try to figure it out every day in my work. But I don't have the answer. I will say, however, that what I do has led me to the realization that if any of us, but if I were to make a list of traits that I think define us, our species, Homo sapiens, today, I guarantee you that the list would either consist of traits that also characterize many of the earlier species in our lineage. They would also have to be included, even as far back as 500,000 years ago, probably. Or the list would be so narrow as to exclude members that we know are our own species, like native Australians or Papua New Guineans. And quite frankly, if native Australians or Papua New Guineans made the list, none of us would probably make it. So one of the things I'm trying to convey to you here is that in anthropology, I think in any science, but certainly even at the most basic intro level class, if you take a basic anthro class, you have to be prepared for a certain tolerance of really fuzzy boundaries. Because as much as we're inclined to divide things up into neat little boxes and call things us and them, or this species and that species, it's just not scientifically supported when you deal with creatures as complex as ourselves, when you look at either living humans or humans that lived in the past, in the fossil record. But it doesn't mean that the science of paleoanthropology is messy or arbitrary. It's a reflection of the reality of humanity, which doesn't divide itself up into neat, nice, isolated little categories, either through space or time. So I told you at the beginning of the talk that one of the things I was going to discuss was how anthropologists conduct their science. And hopefully now you have some idea. We rely, first of all, on the repeatability of our results to refine and test our hypotheses and understand where things go on our evolutionary lineage, if they should go there at all. But also, as paleoanthropologists, we have to, any physical anthropologist has to have a higher tolerance for very fuzzy boundaries because we're dealing with such a bizarre species, humans. That's a little easier to talk about. How to address the question of what it means to be human is a little bit harder, in part because it's a shifting target. The socio-political times change. We can say today for certain that the hominid lineage is defined by bipedalism, but as we get closer to our own species, Homo sapiens, it's now becoming much murkier. And I don't honestly know what makes us unique. I haven't found anything, honestly, that makes us unique, at least in terms of the fossil record. So I go back and forth between these two different, sometimes competing, but sometimes complementary thoughts. On one hand, knowing the fossil record, as I do, seeing the origins of our hominid lineage, knowing about the behavior and the biology of our closest living relatives, the primates, and seeing the continuum between them, seeing the fuzzy boundaries and realizing that that's a natural reality, really makes me appreciate the continuum of the animal kingdom and how we really aren't that unique. We are not that much more special than any other creature that's lived on Earth. We're just one of a billion species on Earth, billions of species ever to have lived. We're a drop in the bucket, and it's really very humbling. We are by no means more successful or more innovative than any other species to have lived. Sharks, dinosaurs lived for a couple 100 million years. That's successful. Today, sharks have had the same body plan for at least the last 65 million years. That is evolutionary success. We can't say that yet. But on the other hand, doing this for a living, you realize that we really are different. Clearly, we're unique in our adaptation. We have language. We have self-reflection. We have the ability to study ourselves. No other creature does that. Last year, I was teaching a course in evolutionary theory, and I said to my students how it's kind of embarrassing because what we do is so utterly narcissistic, and we just sit around and talk about ourselves and study ourselves for a living. It just feels so self-indulgent. And one of my students said that, in fact, what she thinks is that studying humans, studying ourselves, is the ultimate expression of our adaptation. It is the most human thing to do, to turn the microscope back on ourselves, to be our own unit of study. That is the most quintessentially human activity. No other creature does that. So that made me feel a lot less self-involved. I was really glad she said that. But I have to say that these two parts, these two thoughts, that on one hand we are part of the animal kingdom. We're just another species in the natural world. And on the other hand, that we do have these unique capacities. I think the way that I reconcile them is to be aware of the fact that we have a greater responsibility now. We have to exercise judgment, which is something that is not a burden I think any other species really has. We have to exercise judgment before we kill off other species, before we kill off their habitats, before we rip them out of their natural environment and stick them in cages so that we can go stare at them and bring our kids to stare at them. And what I think this means is that it's not our mental capacities that define us, it's how we choose to use them that really is going to be the defining legacy of our species. So I'd like to end with a quote about Tong. It was an editorial published in the Observer newspaper, which is a British newspaper, after Tong's initial announcement in 1925. Oh, and my picture of Tong is gone. That's okay. It said, "There must needs be some who say that the discovery of a damaged skull in subtropical Africa makes no difference. Admittedly, it does not affect us materially, like the discovery of wireless or electric light. The difference is in the outlook. The stimulus to all progress is man's innate belief that he can grasp the scheme of things and his place therein. But this stimulus compels him to track his career backward to its first beginning, as well as to carry it forward to its ultimate end. The more clearly he sees whence he has come, the more clearly he will discern whither he is bound." And that's it. Thank you very much.